So hi, everyone, and welcome to Understanding the U.S., EU, NATO Axis of Domination in Africa and the Americas. This teaching is sponsored by the Resist NATO Coalition. Thank you to the Black Alliance for Peace and the Palestinian Youth Movement members for putting the content of this webinar together. We're organizing this webinar as part of our buildup to the People's Summit and mobilization against NATO on July 6th and 7th. The purpose of the webinar is to help viewers better understand how imperialism is behind NATO's quest to plunder and dominate nations all over the world. It should help us better understand the history of NATO and present-day implications of NATO's global expansion so we can be ready to resist when it comes to DC in July to advance its dangerous agenda. Next, I'd like to introduce Jameela and Petros of Black Alliance for Peace. For those of you out there not familiar with the organization, the Black Alliance for Peace, or BAP, seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement. Through educational activities, organizing, and movement support, organizations and individuals in the Alliance will work to oppose both militarized domestic state repression and the policies of destabilization, subversion, and the permanent war agenda of the U.S. state globally. So I'm happy to pass it off to Jameela and Petros of BAP to get us started.
Thank you so much, Katie. Peace, everyone. My name is Jameela Alexander, and I am from the Black Alliance for Peace. And me and my comrade Petros Bein of the Black Alliance for Peace will be presenting this presentation today, Understanding the U.S.-EU NATO Axis of Domination in Africa and the Americas. So just a quick overview of this presentation is that it will be an in-depth discussion of NATO's history and its enduring impact on Africa and the Americas. And we're going to go into deep detail here about it. So if you can move on to the next slide for me, please, comrade. Thank you. So before we go into this presentation, we would like to just do a quick vocabulary overview because we know that a lot of these words are new for people, and sometimes they're older for people, but it's important for us to have a clear understanding of the language that we're using so we're all on the same page about what we're talking about today. So just starting off with the first definition is hegemony. Okay, so hegemony is the predominance of one state or social group over others. And then we have capitalism, which is a worldwide exploitation under non-imperialist countries, for example, the global South. Under imperialism, each major power has carved out a niche of the world to exploit, and they still maintain an irresistible need to expand, okay? So this example of this is like European colonial powers establishing links with their colonies through multinational corporations, banks, and other financial institutions. And then we also have imperialism. So this is the economic system which private individuals are allowed to own and control the means of production. So for example, mines or banks or farms or even a forest. And they will allow themselves to accumulate all this wealth from the labor of the workers that work that land or inside of those institutions, and they'll receive less money for their labor than actually what the value is. And then we have next, which is fascism, which is a repressive form of government that takes on police state characteristics. So in all that, they're all forms of political, economical, and social opposition that's forcibly suppressive to maintain the status quo for the classic rules. So we see a lot of that going on today. We also see as well as colonialism, which is total domination of one country by another. We see that right now, modern day, for example, our brothers and sisters over in Palestine, them being colonized by the Israelis. This is the Israeli state. Is a perfect example of modern day colonialism. And then the definition of settler colonialism is even more of an explanation of the state of Israel, because that's what it is. It's a settler colonial state. And that is a form of colonialism where this colonizer comes, they stay, they occupy the land with settlers, and then they exploit it economically and culturally. So this is an ongoing system of power that perpetuates genocide and repression amongst indigenous peoples and cultures. And then last but not least, we have a definition on here that may not be familiar to few, but it is familiar inside of the Black Alliance for Peace. And we're very large on this, which is people-centered human rights. So this is a non-oppressive right that reflects the highest commitment to universal human dignity and social justice that individuals and collectives can define and secure for themselves through social struggle. So
I'm not
really,
too
really
familiar
important,
with it.
and honestly, the
I've
main
been
focus
around.
of all of the work that we do inside of the anti-imperialist work. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so before we go into further inside of the presentation, we would like to have just a quick background sort of groundings for what we're talking about, why we're talking about it, and the purpose of it. So inside of this slide, we have an example from Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. If you all do not know who Walter Rodney is, he is a groundbreaking, brilliant Caribbean scholar and political activist who gave us two really, really important pieces and many more that we all use to curate our understanding of what's going on around the world, but in particular, what's going on around the world as it pertains to colonialism and imperialism and how it impacts all of us, but in particularly Africa, right? So inside of this book, he says, needless to say, in 1950s, when most Africans were still colonial subjects, they had absolutely no control over the utilization of their soil for militaristic ends. Virtually, the whole of North Africa was turned into a sphere for operations for NATO, with bases aimed at the Soviet Union. There could have easily developed a nuclear war without African peoples having enough knowledge on the matter. The colonial powers actually held military conferences in African cities like Dakar and Nairobi in the early 1950s, inviting the whites of South Africa and Rhodesia and the government in the United States of America. Time and time again, the evidence points to the cynical use of Africa as a buttress of capitalism economically and militarily. Therefore, in effect, forcing Africa to contribute to its own exploitation. And so this is from chapter 5, Africa's contribution to the capitalist development of Europe and the colonial period. And that's on page 108. And yeah, it's really important for us to understand that this is not something that's random. The same people that are associated with colonizing the world are the same people and countries that are associated with finding and controlling NATO today. So we can move on to the next slide. So what is NATO? What purpose does it serve? And why are we even talking about it today? So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is an illegitimate body, aggressive body that is in the service of Western imperialism. So at present today, right now we may hear things about NATO's expansion towards Eastern Europe, which in effect is just pretty as a reductionist concept, right? So the truth is, since the end of the bipolar world, the United States, believing itself to be the master of the world, has used NATO to expand throughout the planet. And proof of this is between the signing of multiple treaties between other settler states or imperialist states to continue to maintain control over parts of the world like Africa, the Americas, and Asia, and as well as Europe. So currently, NATO is expressing its attempt to militarize their domination around the entire world through, especially through one of its US-led proxy wars in Ukraine. And so since its colonial inception, NATO has been strategically doing these sorts of aggressive, very, very antagonistic missions and actions towards other countries in the world, and then punishing them if these countries do not bend to the need of these NATO-led this NATO-led institution. So, for example, we have countries like the United States, Canada, Italy, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Spain, and Belgium. Some of the world's earliest colonizers are the people that are the main organizers inside of NATO today. So we can move to the next slide, and we're going to go through just a quick timeline as to, okay, when did this all start, or where are we at today? So first of all, NATO was founded in 1949. And the year that it was founded by a selection of colonial powers, but the majority of them were the United States, the UK, France, Portugal, Belgium, and Italy. They were the main organizers of NATO. And at the time, they were also the main colonizers of parts of the world that we were seeing that were going through a lot of colonial aggressions and changes. So for example, we know that it's founded in this year, but we know that they immediately expanded into North Africa because they had bases in North Africa where the colonies were. So it's really, really important to understand that NATO was founded under the pretext that it was for as an institution to be against Soviet aggression, right? But off bat, NATO immediately became extremely aggressive to not only the Soviet Union, but other parts of the world. So in the 1950s, we see a lot of anti-colonial wars pop up on the continent. And so, for example, we see the PIAGC struggling against Portuguese colonization, and the Mozambique Liberation Front struggling for their own independence and their self-determination as well. And Portugal was losing. And so they had to call in their NATO allies to help them beat back these freedom fighters and beat back them into colonial control. Now, of course, it didn't work, but the idea is that these European countries are using other European countries to go into areas that they colonized to keep the peace, to control the world. And this is where we're starting to really see like this US, EU, NATO axis of domination sprouting up in the early 1950s. So we skip about 20 years later to 1984, and we know that Southcom was expanding itself, and that is a program that is inside of Latin America, and their mission is really, it's a US-led program, but their mission really is to just maintain control over the Americas through military exercises and military domination. So we know that the first Operation Trade Winds began in 1984, and that pretty much is an operation where you see US or NATO troops going into these right-wing countries and training these aggressive military forces. So we see that happening there and still now until today. And so into 1991, we also see the fall of the Soviet Union, which was the purpose of NATO's founding. And so you would expect after the fall of the Soviet Union for NATO to disband and for them to move forward, because the threat that they said that was the purpose of their founding is now eliminated, which did not happen, because NATO was never about the Soviet Union. It was always about maintaining and trying to gain control, militarized control over the world. So we also see in 2007 a sprout up under the Bush administration in the United States of AFRICOM. And what we see inside of AFRICOM is this need for bases to expand on the African continent. We'll talk a little bit later about AFRICOM and some of the implications that it brings onto the African people and also the African diaspora. But just please keep that in mind, that that started in 2007. And then also we see 4 years later, the destruction of Libya. And under the destruction of Libya, NATO bombed its infrastructure and supported the terrorists that ended up murdering Gaddafi. And this was all done under Barack Obama. And so understanding that there was no way that NATO was going to even be able to expand militarily without having a blackface imperialist leader leading it. And yeah, so they had to bomb Libya, they had to destroy it so that they could expand AFRICOM on the African continent. And then still today that we see bases in every African country except for Eritrea. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so why Africa? Why the Americas? I bet you guys are all sitting there like, well, again, this is a North Atlantic treaty. Why are they so focused on Africa and the Americas? Well, remember when I mentioned earlier that the main colonizers of the world were also the founders of NATO? So we have to understand that Western imperialism historically has linked this plunder through Africa, Asia, and the Americas. So this colonial relationship, this dependent relationship that these colonial empires cannot survive without these colonies or these neo-colonies to support their empire, they won't be able to exist. So there's just a connection between the colonial relationship in Africa and the Americas that just show us the current day US, EU, NATO axis of domination. And it's really, really important for us to keep an internationalist lens, not only because our enemies do, but because we are the only people in the world who have been captured by imperialism. And it's important for us to unite together against it. So, like I said before, in 1949, the US, the UK, France, Portugal, Belgium, and Italy, they were the main organizers of NATO. And they said their purpose was to defend itself against the Soviet Union, even though they went to North Africa and immediately set up nuclear weapons to point towards the Soviet Union. And then we see, you know, that most of North Africa was turned into a NATO operations base. There was even developed weapons that were built on African soil towards the destruction of the Soviet Union, a country that actually was, in a way, not harmful to Africa, right? So there's that part. And then so we go to the next section, and we also understand that Kwame Nkrumah in this handbook for revolutionary warfare talks about the need to counter NATO for the betterment of all colonized Africans. And then in extension, of course, all colonized people. Now, this book was written over 50 years ago, and it still reigns true today. So again, how are they still able to do this in Africa and the Americas? Well, neocolonialism, right? We talked about that definition earlier, but it's really important to have a puppet class in place in Africa and the Americas whose sole mission is to protect the Western interests from doing whatever it takes to do to keep the indigenous people and the colonized people under domination and under control. So yeah, there's nothing that can happen without the comprador class inside of Africa or the Americas. And again, the colonizers would not be able to achieve their mission without this puppet class. And then so last but not least, so we have NATO, AFRICOM, and SOUTHCOM. It's really, really important, and we'll have a couple of videos later on in the slides so that you guys can have a breakdown, but it's really important for us to understand that AFRICOM is a direct product of NATO from the EU command, which is the central command of NATO. And as I mentioned before, there was no way that Africa was going to expand onto the African continent without assassinating Gaddafi, which it was the president and leader of Libya, a true Pan-Africanist, a true Pan-Arab. And he really believed in us all uniting together against these imperialist Western countries that have been colonizing and sacking our countries for hundreds and hundreds of years. So without murdering him, there was no way that these NATO bases would pop up. And then also in that same breath, destroying Libya's infrastructure and murdering Gaddafi sent these terrorists that were destabilizing the Libyan country, that were also being paid by the Western governments, being funded by them. They spread out from Libya, my apologies, and went down into the south. We see them going into the Sahel and also other parts of Western Africa. And that is why actually today, about 15 so years later, we see these uprisings with the African people inside of the Sahel, because they're tired. They're tired of being lied to. They're tired of being told that we're here to help you by the Western countries. We're here to help you against these terrorists. And these are these terrorists that are doing all these things. It's been so long and so much turmoil and so much pain that these people, these states, the Alliance of the Sahelian states, they've risen up and they've said, get out and we'll do it ourselves. And so this is an example of self-determination that, it can inspire us all around the world. So with that being said, I'm going to pass off this part of the presentation to my comrade Petros, and I wanted to thank you all for listening.
Thank you, John. That was a good explanation of U.S. and NATO's political project. Can you go to the next slide, please? So NATO's mission of expansion is the tendency of this political project, which is a white supremacist political project. Since its inception in 1949, when the Western European and the US could not maintain its previous levels of domination after World War II, NATO has always been about the subjugation of non-Europeans through force for resources. So as my comrade Ja said previously, this project is following finance capital and capital across the world, but it's also about controlling the resources on other people's lands, similar to colonialism and neocolonialism. This also follows the expansion of the military operations of AFRICOM and SOUTHCOM. And these weapons get sent to the puppet governments who are controlled by the US and EU. And they just basically enact war on the people within the borders of those nations and break up resistance movements and just really just crush the people. Through these commands, the US is also arming Taiwan, the settler colonial state of Israel, and Ukraine just to continue its expansion and its presence in particular areas, just to maintain the control. Next slide will be a video from the Black Alliance for Peace. Let's talk about AFRICOM.
Militarized police violence carried out against Black and other non-European colonized peoples domestically, and the brutal violence of the U.S. military and intelligence agencies abroad are two sides of the same white supremacist colonial capitalist coin. That is why for the Black Alliance for Peace, it is vital that the public understand this connection. The U.S.-made bombs bursting in air remind us that U.S. imperialism is still alive and well. The U.S. commitment to the concept of full-spectrum global dominance is carried out in many forms, including 11 command centers that are headquartered across the world. The U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, puts most African states under the effective military control of the United States. The Indo-Pacific Command is the counterpart to AFRICOM in the Asia-Pacific and is being used to direct military aggression towards China. 2 years after the end of the Second Imperialist War in 1945, the U.S. established the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Center in 1947, formerly known as the U.S. Pacific Command Center. Its area of responsibility encompasses about half the Earth's surface. The 36 nations that comprise the Asia-Pacific region are home to more than 50% of the world's population. The U.S. has 375,000 enlisted members of its Indo-Pacific Command, including 60% of its Navy ships, 55% of its armies, and 2/3 of its Marine Corps. In addition, with 85,000 forward deployed soldiers and a large amount of high-tech and new weaponry, the U.S. military has maintained its absolute supremacy in the Asia-Pacific over the years, while also continuing to seek new deployments, budgets, and resources, using the threat of China's and Russia's strategic rivalry as a justification. South Korea, Guam, Australia, Malaysia, and a host of other countries have strengthened military arrangements with the United States over the last decade. In 2007, the Bush administration announced the establishment of the U.S. African Command Structure.
We're going to Benin, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ghana, and Liberia. Each of these countries is blessed with natural beauty, vibrant culture, and an unmistakable spirit of energy and optimism. Africa in the 21st century is a continent of potential.
AFRICOM, that was then fully launched on October 1st, 2008. The U.S., which currently has the largest military budget in its history, spends nearly $2 billion per year to carry out imperialism in Africa. A study by the UN concluded that in the majority of cases, state action appears to be the primary factor finally pushing individuals into violent extremism in Africa. Of more than 500 former members of militant organizations interviewed for the report, 71% pointed to government action, including killing of a family member or friend, or arrest of a family member or friend as the incident that prompted them to join a group. And the cycle continues. Drone attacks breed recruitment, which produces further terror attacks, which leave the states involved more dependent on U.S. military support. This is how the West creates the demand for AFRICOM. We must demand that the U.S. shut down AFRICOM and the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. No compromise, no retreat. No compromise, no retreat.
The independence of Ghana is not for any sin. Oh, yeah. I can tell them that the good people of this country, overwhelming majority of people of this country, flatly and totally reject this attempt to send us back into colonialism. We will never be colonized again.
It's real, y'all. U.S. and Kenya's continued war on terror and Africans. The U.S. has been restructuring the Kenyan Defense Forces to become more aligned with the vision of fighting terrorism. We've heard that before. For example, on May 5th, 2023, the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi announced the introduction of a newly created Marine unit within the KDF. The stated purpose was to fight terrorism. So, as we've seen on May 5th, Kenya was told what to do by the U.S. At every step of the way since 1963, Kenya has worked against African independence. During the anti-apartheid struggles, Kenya supported UNITA and the MNR for good measure. Western security established the banking infrastructure for illicit dealing through Bank of Credit and Commerce International. There was the formation of the Safari Club C, France, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Morocco, and the conservative elements of the USA. So Kenya has already been working alongside at the behest of the US. And even more recently in the news, the US has told Kenya under Ruto's leadership to send militarized police into Haiti, just not listening to the demands of the people on the ground in Haiti. Also, publicly criminalizing the people in Haiti, saying that they're gangs, that they're cannibals. But the reason why there's instability in Haiti is, I mean, since the Haitian Revolution and more recently since '04, the U.S. has continued to shake up leadership, coup governments, kill people, just do whatever to maintain its control in that area. But this is also not just the U.S. The U.S. is also using commands like CARICOM and SOUTHCOM to maintain its presence in that region and domination over people who do not want them in that area in the first place. Those people have been asking for something different, and the U.S. is telling them, no, we want your resources, and we're going to go in there. The U.S. and Canada, with the core group members, are also leading this charge to push through military control in Haiti, but it's also using Kenya, right, to do that. And the core group consists of US, Canada, and France. Next slide, please. Kenya, the Kenyan Communist Party, in recent news, they're in the streets protesting and making demands. But the Communist Party of Kenya demands that the Kenya Kwanzaa government rescind their proposal to send 1,000 police to Haiti, while calling on the Kenyan people to join the Haitian masses and popular progressive forces worldwide in opposing the intervention, continued occupation, and neo-colonial governance of Haiti by the core group and the UN. In August, this was published in August 2023. The core group and NATO and the UN, though the names might abstract something or confuse people, this is all NATO. This is all US controlled, with the West to again maintain its dominance over its former colonies, and to make sure that the extraction remains the same. The Kenyan Peasant League, who understand the land question in that area, they want to mobilize Kenyan peasant farmers and consumers to push for agrarian reforms and practice organic farming to ensure food sovereignty and environmental conservation. But external forces are trying to maintain its control over Kenya and make sure that Kenya does the things that the U.S. wants it to do. Next slide.
The police, the prison system, the law. It's no secret that these institutions intentionally crush and terrorize Black and oppressed people within the U.S. But the brutal violence the U.S. military inflicts on colonized Black and brown people
is often hidden from our view. Even though the U.S. military is the largest and most expensive of any country, by far.
We have new, beautiful equipment that comes along with $2.5 trillion in spending, all made in the USA.
The U.S. military has literally divided the earth into 11 areas of responsibility, each patrolled by a different command.
The U.S. Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, polices one of these areas of responsibility. The SOUTHCOM region covers 15 million miles
and represents about 1/6 of the landmass of the world. Headquartered in Miami, U.S. Southern Command includes 32 countries, 19 in Central and South America and 13 in the Caribbean.
And that's not to mention 16 U.S. colonies like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which don't have political independence as sovereign states and are not represented in the U.S. government.
Southcom grew out of the U.S. military occupation of Panama in the first decade of 1900. This was when the U.S. government built the Panama Canal to secure trade routes for its elite and business class. It was established during World War II, originally under the name Caribbean Defense Command,
and formalized the government's control over the Caribbean, which had begun decades prior during the Panama invasion. Now, Southcom has at least 4 bases in the region, including Guantanamo Bay in Cuba.
The U.S. military uses its bases in Honduras and El Salvador as access points to reach other strategic locations, such as Nicaragua, Venezuela and Colombia, and Guatemala.
Joint exercises and military-to-military contact programs between the United States and regional militaries are a major aspect of Southcom's activities.
While Southcom says these military operations promote security cooperation,
we built that team, we built that camaraderie,
build regional partnerships, and strengthen democratic principles. In reality, Southcom programs have supported dictatorial regimes and militarized governments in the region,
like that of Papa and Baby Doc, who ruled Haiti in the late 1950s until the mid-1980s.
And the Colombian government, which right now is killing indigenous and African-descended human and land rights activists.
These governments do the bidding of the U.S. by economically exploiting their own country for the benefit of U.S. corporations and by squashing popular rebellion.
As natural disasters and political crises, including the U.S.-led war on drugs, escalated in the 1990s, Southcom activity increased.
Good evening. This is the first time since taking the oath of office that I felt an issue was so important, so threatening, that it warranted talking directly with you, the American people. All of us agree that the gravest domestic threat facing our nation today is drugs. Tonight, I'm announcing a strategy that reflects the coordinated, cooperative commitment of all our federal agencies.
Every year, Southcom uses humanitarian assistance exercises and disaster response efforts as military training platforms.
But instead of stemming drug flows and feeding the poor, Southcom's true goal is to destabilize socialist countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, as well as disrupt Latin American and Caribbean nations' relationship with Russia, China, and Iran.
The absolute urgency with which we have to maintain our competitive edge in this region, increasingly contested strategic space in the global competition with China and Russia. And we do maintain our positional advantage here. However, that advantage is eroding, and it's challenging our ability to maintain the favorable balance of regional power directly called for here in this hemisphere in the National Defense Strategy.
The Black Alliance for Peace stands against the growing influence and power of Southcom and its ever-increasing militarization of the region.
We demand the end of Southcom and call for a zone of peace in Latin America and the Caribbean, in which the people's right to self-determination is realized.
And conflicts between nations are resolved peacefully. No compromise, no retreat.
So what is the Monroe Doctrine and how does it fit into NATO? So NATO, I mean, even an acronym, North Atlantic, it is a process developed from the slave trade, but it's also a combining of the of the U.S. and Western Europe. It's also the U.S. expressing that the whole Western Hemisphere belongs to it, which isn't true. The Monroe Doctrine is an expression of the U.S. colonial ambitions to dominate the Western Hemisphere. This U.S. colonial process reached another level in 1823 when colonial empires were competing to control other people. By 2023, the US had installed numerous military bases across the region, 12 in Panama, 12 in Puerto Rico, 9 in Colombia, 8 in Peru, 3 in Honduras, 2 in Paraguay, as well as installations in Aruba, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Cuba, Guantanamo in particular, among other countries. This demonstrates the US ongoing efforts to achieve total control over the land and the maritime areas of the region. So the US is essentially waging war on the whole Western Hemisphere to control its resources with all these military bases, but also using these tools, these guns, these ships, planes to subjugate the rest of the area. The Monroe Doctrine emerged from the colonization and genocide of indigenous peoples in what is now North America. NATO represents a continuation and expansion of this colonial process. And also kidnapping and transporting and destabilizing the African continent. NATO represents a continuation and expansion of this colonial process. After World War II, former colonial powers resolved their conflicts or attempted to resolve their conflicts, rebuilt and established NATO to maintain their global influence and dominance. Next slide. Argentina currently has elected a so-called anarcho-capitalist. Sergio Rodriguez on Black Agenda Report, quote, in Argentine territorial waters in the Malvinas Island, which are usurped by the United Kingdom, there's a NATO presence integrated in a system formed by bases on the islands of Ascension, Santa Elena and Tristan de Azuena, which guards the entire Atlantic from the north to the Antarctic Sea. So they are trying their best and continuing military control and direct control over these areas and their resources. The US views Argentina as strategically important due to its natural resources and military partnership with NATO. Key opportunities for cooperation include the green energy transition. So the US is going to basically use them and control, their puppets in Argentina to control those resources. And they're going to focus on lithium, natural gas, copper, and copper exploration and ocean fisheries protection. The US and NATO sees potential in investing in Argentina's lithium industry to enhance energy infrastructure and lithium ion battery production. Additionally, Argentina's technical expertise and growing commercial capabilities offer opportunities for regional space collaboration. So the US wants to use their areas to just control the actual space in Argentina. President Milei's commitment, the current president of Argentina, does not want to have any alliances with communists. That reads BRICS also. Communist blocs and seeking closer ties with the US and Israel is a part of their strategy for their overall partnership. And Ja's gonna take this next slide to talk about the zone of peace.
Okay, peace, everyone. So yes, why are we talking about a zone of peace? What is the zone of peace, right? So I am a member of the Black Alliance for Peace, but I also am a member of the Haiti Americas team, which is a part of the Black Alliance for Peace. And one of the campaigns that we are a part of is the Zone of Peace campaign, making our Americas a zone of peace. So the Black Alliance for Peace, along with key partner organizations across the Americas, have partnered together to lead and activate in an effort to activate the popular movements in our region in support of the community of Latin American and Caribbean states, or you may know them as CELAC. 2014 call to make the Americas a zone of peace. So this campaign is really important because, again, it's a people-centered human rights campaign. We're really focused on the structures and interests that generate war and state violence. For example, colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, and all forms of imperialism. So the fight for a zone of peace is an attempt to expel all of these nefarious forces from our region. And you all can check out our Zone of Peace campaign. My comrade Erica Kane should be sending a link of that inside of our chat. But if it's not inside of there, you can go to our website at the Black Alliance for Peace.org, and we will have a Zone of Peace tab on there as well. So I'm going to pass it back to Petros, and we're going to wrap it up.
Thank you, Ja. Next slide. So these are some necessary readings just to add to today's current conversation and webinar. Some of the titles that you can read, and hopefully you continue reading after this and read even more, and go to our website. NATO in Africa by Jibu Sobukwe. NATO's growing military presence in Latin America and the Caribbean by Sergio Rodriguez Gelfstein, who I quoted in the presentation. Our Resist NATO Coalition Toolkit has plenty more in there. NATO and Africa, a relationship of colonial violence and structural white supremacy by Jibo Sobukwe again. NATO in the Amazon, Petro Plays with Fire, not me, by Roger D. Harris, and our Zone of Peace campaign. Next slide. Before you use this, the toolkit is also in the chat if you would like to click it. But here's the QR code for the Resist NATO toolkit. Please scan if you have your phone available. And please engage everything. Next slide. So please, 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 thank you for tuning in, and thank you for engaging the content in our presentation. On Instagram, you can find Resist NATO, resist.nato, Black Alliance for Peace, one word. On Instagram, BAP_Baltimore, BAP-Baltimore, AAPRP International, and UPP Maryland. Also, July 6th and 7th, Resist NATO Coalition, People Summit and Mobilization. Resist U.S. NATO aggression and war provocations, defend people's struggles for rights and liberation. So save this date, July 6th to the 7th in Washington, D.C. You can also register on the link at the bottom.
All right. Thank you, Petros. Thank you, Jameela. Just reminding everyone that we still have one more presentation after this. Members of Palestinian Youth Movement will be talking to us about NATO in the Middle East. But before we go there, we are going to allocate about 10 minutes for questions on BAP's presentation. So what I suggest is people put your questions in the chat for us to easily identify them. So at this point, I don't see questions. Okay.
I have one. I'm just typing it out. Sorry.
Perfect. Amazing. Are you able to see it? There's two actually. So the first, how do we counter the lies of imperialists who say that any criticism of NATO is just Russian propaganda?
Let me just read the question. How do we counter the lies of imperialists who say that any criticism of NATO is just Russian propaganda? First, observe, I would say just observe the world around you. Is Russia at your door? Is Russia creating cop cities? Is Russia militarizing the police around you? Is Russia, I mean, like, is that Russia or is that the US? Is the US funding Ukraine and building up those weapons? Is the US continuously funding a genocide? I think just ask yourself, where did you hear that any criticism of NATO is Russian propaganda? And then like just follow it back. It's the US, it is the West, it's Western Europe, it is NATO countries. I think that you could start there, observe it, and then also I know for me personally, joining an organization and engaging in various struggles, it keeps me sharp, right? It keeps me sharp. It keeps me engaged with material that helps to counteract that propaganda that the U.S. and its lackeys try to impose on us and put on us. That's my brief answer.
Do I just pick a question from the chat? There's a lot. Is that okay?
There are a lot, but yeah, if you don't have anything more to add to Petros' response, then feel free to pick one.
Okay, yeah, my comrade, he wrapped it up pretty quickly. We have to remember that we live in an imperial empire, so we're always going to be pushed a lot of propaganda. So we just gotta look for sources outside of what we see in our face. So there's a question in here that says, can either of you speak about Operation Trade Winds in the Caribbean, how it relates to NATO? Yes, so Operation Trade Winds is a collusion of militarized white supremacy and Black neocolonialism in the Caribbean. So we see participation from nations like Guyana, Brazil, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Bermuda, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Tobago. So pretty much it is it's a operation of the U.S. Southern Command, and it's sponsored. It's pretty much to work alongside like militarized governments or the military in some of these governments of the countries that I named about, and specifically with militarized exercises. So we'll see that across the entire region of the Americas, but in specifically Latin America. And the way that it relates to NATO in particularly is because these exercises are really with personnel from Southcom. So the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, the Netherlands. And so these military exercises also will lead people into other systems that the United States has to continue terrorizing the world. And the point of why it really relates to NATO is that we're trying to make it very clear that NATO is not a separate entity to the United States or even some of these other Western European countries' missions and goals. So yeah, NATO is one branch of the militarization that we see happening all around the world. So I hope that answers your question, and I'll yield there for Petros. you want to answer anything.
I just wanted to add that this isn't a neo-colonial, I mean, there's a colonial relationship, but it is trying to move past just a neo-colonial relationship to just a colonial relationship and control those people with the comprador class and the will of capitalists in the US and NATO. That's all.
Would you like to pick a question, Petros? I don't know if we can get to everything, but I'll give you your choice.
I'm just gonna look through the chat.
Do the Eritrea one.
Okay. For Eritrea, I would just say, just for the sake of time, just because of their resistance, their independence resistance, after expelling the U.S., Italy from what is now Eritrea, and they've maintained their independence in that area. If you also see that the U.S.'s relationship in the Horn with particular countries is always trying to gain access to the Red Sea and control the trade and relationships in that area. Just to briefly talk about why Eritrea isn't in there.
And I think I can get to one more. So someone asks, I'm curious about any of these experiences speaking with people from these communities about these issues. What are a lot of talking points you've noticed from them? Have there been any ways you've countered them with any impact? Yeah, so I guess so we are the people that have been impacted by these experiences, right? And I think that that's like the starting point, right? So when you're talking to humans, other people, comrades, friends, whatever, from maybe that are born on the African continent or born in outside of the belly of the beast, inside of the imperialist empire that we grew up in, they are much more politically clear than we are. They are much more aware of their where they're at socially inside of their lives, and then how imperialism has impacted them and their families and the way of their living, compared to some of us here, where it's harder to explain it because it may look like on the outside that we have such a better life than people from other parts of the world. So one talking point that I will see is that sometimes you got to like have conversations with them and explain like you're not like a typical person that grew up in the United States that just believes in US state propaganda. And also we don't believe in just because you said it happened, right? We're really big on talking with people and hearing their experiences, but also like hearing the information and research they have to like back that up, right? Because people can say a lot of things and that may not be spot on. Have there been any ways that you have countered them with this impact? Honestly, I haven't had a conversation with anyone from other parts of outside of the United States that have been antagonistic or any sort of like ways where I felt like I've had to counter one of their statements. It's a lot about just listening to people and then them listening to you and then seeing like where you all can unite on. And where we unite around is that we believe imperialism needs to go and we need to work on destroying that. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, but I yield there.